Thank you for joining us today to talk about how employees are weird. We're going to address how to leverage cognitive bias and behavioral economics to improve employee benefit decisions. We're also going to address how you can utilize these two things to improve all of your marketing efforts, not just employee benefit communications, but also the marketing efforts you put forth to attract new clientele and to build your own consultancies. Bit about myself, tell you why I'm even talking to you about this topic today, and why you should even take my word for all of this. So very quickly, I'm a graduate from Arizona State University. I then went on to get my master's in business administration degree from Georgetown University. I spent a good portion of my career working on a lot of big brands: General Motors, Philip Morris, Coca-Cola, AOL Time Warner. I worked both on the agency side of the business as well as the client side of the business. I worked on a lot of brands underneath these products. You can see from Netscape and MoviePhone to Wendy's, Oldsmobile, General Motors, etc. All this is just to say that I've spent a lot of time in marketing. I've been in the employee benefits space for about 7.5 years now, and I continue to see enormous opportunity for us to deploy some really tried and true marketing tactics to everything we do. I want to start by taking you back to the mid-1980s. Pepsi was not the behemoth beverage juggernaut it is today. In fact, Coke really dominated the segment across all channels, across dining, vending, supermarket. But in a stroke of what can only be called brilliant guerrilla marketing, Pepsi launched something called the Pepsi Taste Test Challenge. Technically, it was a double-blind taste test. They'd set up kiosks in shopping centers and at grocery. They would bring in an unsuspecting consumer. They would have them sample an ounce of one cola and an ounce of another cola without unveiling to them which brand was which. And they'd have them pick which one they preferred. And not surprisingly, otherwise it wouldn't have become a Pepsi campaign, they picked Pepsi the majority of the time. Now, the reason for this was that in small amounts, our taste profiles tend to like sweeter, less carbonated things. That's really not how we consume soda. We typically consume it in 16, 20, 32 ounce, 48 ounce portions, but that's beside the point. The campaign at the time started to gain traction. It was really the first campaign Pepsi had had in a long time that started to scare Coca-Cola, and Goliath actually blinked. So Coca-Cola got to work. They decided to tweak their brand formula to more closely emulate Pepsi. Again, less carbonated, a little bit sweeter. And they researched the hell out of the concept. They had focus groups all over the world, taste tests across every demographic. The Coke folks were brilliant marketers, and the concept was testing really well. But the one key question they failed to ask in all of this research was, would it be okay if this new Coke replaced the Coke that's already there today? Well, these were the two guys at the helm back then. The gentleman on the left is then CEO Roberto Goizueta, and on the right is President Don Keough. This picture was taken on the day they launched New Coke back in April of 1985. It would be the last time either of them smiled for quite a while. The launch of New Coke would be one of the most famous marketing debacles of all time. Consumer backlash was fast and furious. Hundreds of thousands of letters poured into their headquarters. People took to the streets in protest. It dominated the broadcast news and print news cycles. A consortium of Coca-Cola bottlers even sued the parent company for changing the formula. I mean, how bad do you have to screw up that your own supply chain is suing you? Well, 80 days later, and with a whole lot of fanfare, they brought back the old Coke. They rebranded it Coca-Cola Classic, and they made sure not to make the same mistake they just had made. They allowed it to coexist with New Coke for close to 17 years, up until 2002, when everything consolidated back down to one master flagship brand. So here these two guys are again, some 80 days later, finally cracking a smile. Probably because they didn't get fired. Now, these were two extremely intelligent guys, yet they overlooked something we've known about human behavior for quite some time. We simply are not rational thinkers. Yeah, the new Coke was sweeter, it was less carbonated, But Coke was a cultural icon. It's the generic term for what people in the South call soda, and for what people in the Midwest, which is where I'm from, call pop. I mean, I've been around people who order a Coke even when they want a Sprite. It's like the server's supposed to know that. It's the strangest thing. But as consumers, we want it all. We fear change. We have a very powerful cognitive bias known as loss aversion. Now, loss aversion is where people prefer to avoid losses more than to acquire equivalent gains. Let me say that again. It's where people prefer to avoid losses more than to acquire equivalent gains. It's why people tend to get very skittish when the stock market is falling and they sell out of their positions. And it's why we'd rather stick with the old version of Coca-Cola rather than the new version, even when I told you in a blind taste test that I liked it better. In fact, loss aversion is one of the strongest of all the cognitive biases that we're going to talk about today. So I had to throw this meme in here from Napoleon Dynamite for my kids, but a lot of you might be saying, hey, duh, this is obvious. Tell me something I don't know. And I'd like to suggest that we've probably been guilty of making some of the same mistakes Coca-Cola did. It wasn't that long ago that we were replacing copay plans with high deductible health plans. And, the transitions were rather abrupt. We would simply do away with the copay plan, introduce the high deductible, and perhaps in a better way of easing consumers to the transition was to allow both plans to coexist for some period of time. So that's, really what New Coke has taught us, is that you have to slow down when you're introducing change because of this cognitive bias of loss aversion. So here's something pretty interesting about loss aversion. Some researchers tried to quantify the effects of this cognitive bias. And here's what they found. Loss aversion theory posits that losing something you already have feels about twice as significant as gaining something of same value. So I'll say that again. Losing something you already have feels about twice as significant as gaining something of the same value. Have you ever lost $10? Maybe you left it in your pants at the dry cleaners. Well, this research suggests that the pain you felt was more like losing $20, even though you only lost 10. In other words, the pain from the loss was twice the pleasure as if you had found the $10. Now, this theory was first formalized in a research paper in 1992 by two academics, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. It's not too dissimilar from the adage, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. And the phenomenon is not that dissimilar from another bias that we come across called the endowment effect. This is where people place a higher value on a good that they own rather than the identical good that they don't own. Throw a yard sale sometime and you'll quickly see what I'm talking about. You think your driver that you want to sell is worth $150, yet you're only willing to give somebody $45 if they're selling the same driver to you. So it turns out that loss aversion is just one of over 197 cognitive biases in humans. And I've used that term a lot today. So what is a cognitive bias? Well, it's a systemic pattern of deviation from norm or rational judgment. Said another way, it's, perception is reality. Our reality is subjective, and it's based on our perceptions. These biases tend to distort reality to the point where we make illogical interpretations, we make inaccurate judgments. They are oftentimes, but not always, the basis of irrational behavior. So one has to ask, are these cognitive biases bad? Well, for one, it allows us to make faster decisions. And these shortcuts are particularly helpful when timeliness of a decision is more important than, say, the accuracy of a decision. It's widely held belief that the real purpose of a lot of these cognitive biases was our survival as a species early on, and that our brains can only process so much information at a time. Where this concept of our brains taking shortcuts and or being fooled becomes really most evident are in optical illusions. So let's take this optical illusion of the cafe wall. Even if I tell you the lines of the mortar on this wall are all perfectly straight, they still seem to be curved and sloping. There's simply too much information here for your brain to process, so it takes shortcuts, and these shortcuts tend to mislead. So even though we've evolved considerably in the past 2 million years, these biases are still a part of us. And I've got news for you. Because we're now all aware of them, they're being used by marketers all the time. Let's pretend we're going to the movies. I'm hungry, so we stop at Wendy's before the show. Now, I normally wouldn't order a double cheeseburger, but I see that Wendy's now has a triple on the menu. So I think, well, at least the double isn't as piggish as the triple. So I order the double. Well, I just fell for something called the decoy effect. And that's a phenomenon whereby we change our perception between two options when we're presented with a third one. More specifically, I fell for the bias of central tendency. And that is the tendency of consumers to select items in the middle in an effort to avoid the extremes. Now Wendy's knows this. They knew it when they introduced the triple cheeseburger. They probably didn't even care if they sold any triple cheeseburgers. What they were interested in were the sales of the double cheeseburger. And by introducing the triple, it became a more reasonable and accepted item to order off. Now let's get back in the car and keep rolling to the movie theater. Once we get there, you want popcorn. Now, central tendency would suggest you're going to buy that medium. But then you take a look at the prices. The medium is practically the same price as the large. Only a fool would buy the medium. So you buy the large. So what happened there? Well, another cognitive bias kicked in, something called asymmetric dominance. These biases are all of a sudden coming out of the woodwork. Asymmetric dominance is a change in preference between two options when a third option is completely dominated by the one option and only partially dominated by the other. Now that's a real mouthful, but basically here's what's going on here. It simply means that your decision was influenced by how unevenly the middle option was presented. In other words, central tendency was going to suggest you probably were going to buy the middle option and avoid the extremes. Yet it's so closely aligned with the large that you make the jump and you buy the large. It also means that through cognitive bias, you can somewhat manipulate choice. So a natural question to ask at this point is, now that I know of these biases, or when somebody else becomes aware of these biases in themselves, don't we become immune to them? And the short answer is no, and that's because of at least two of the biases that we're going to cover next. So the first of these is called the bias blind spot. It too is a bias in and of itself. It just sounds strange to say bias blind spot bias. It's also a little bit of a tongue twister, as you can tell. Here's the deal. We can easily see how biases affect others, but we often overlook how much they influence us. Don't believe me? Think you're immune? So let me tell you a little story about my 13-year-old daughter. She loves throwing around and misusing the word literally. One day she came up to me and she said, "I literally died when I found out Molly Cyrus was Hannah Montana." I said, "Honey, I think you mean figuratively, because if you meant literally, you'd be dead, and you couldn't be telling me this because you're dead." She said something like, "Okay, boomer," waved her hand and walked out of the room. And if you have teens, hopefully there's some head nodding going on around here. Hopefully some of you can relate to how often this word gets misused in terms of using it in the exact opposite manner in which it's intended. It drives me crazy. So one day I looked it up. That's just the kind of guy I am. I headed out to the old Merriam-Webster dictionary, and there it was in black and white, definition number 1, and a literal sense or manner. And I said, aha, I knew it. But then there was a second definition that I read. It said, in an exaggerated way to emphasize a state or description that is not literally true or possible. I thought to myself, are you kidding me? Do you mean to tell me she has been right all along? I was so sure I was right, I would have bet $10,000 on this. Now, before you go discounting this, thinking that meaning number 2 was added recently or it's part of the Urban Dictionary, I have news for you. It's been listed like this in the Merriam-Webster dictionary since 1903, and the first use of this term in a figurative sense is traced back to 1769. In fact, Charles Dickens used it literally in a figurative sense in 1938 in Nicholas Nickleby. So we were all wrong, yet we were so confident that we were right. And this brings me to our second bias. The second bias to discuss is that of overconfidence. This is the tendency to hold a false or misleading assessment of our own skills, our intellect, or our talent. In short, it's an egotistical belief that we are better than we actually are, that we are typically right. Do you remember a few years ago when there was an image of a dress being shared on social media, and about half the people who saw it swore the dress was brown, and half swore it was blue, and 100% of them thought they were right? There was also an audio file being shared around the same time, and half the people who heard it swore that the word Laurel was being said by the voiceover, while the other half thought it was Yanny. And again, 100% of them thought it was right. There was a lot of overconfidence going on. Friends of mine who know that I study and speak on cognitive bias often claim that they would be immune to these once they became aware of them. Yet almost all of them fall for the following scenario. They're willing to consider moving to a different grocery store if they could save a quarter on a gallon of milk, yet none of them would ever consider changing bike stores to save the same quarter, the same 25 cents on the purchase of a bicycle. Why? It's the same exact amount of money saved. It's simply irrational, and they're overconfident that they aren't affected by these biases. So with that in mind about our minds, let's open our minds to see how we can apply this to our own industry. I love this quote from a Wall Street Journal article written in 2014. The title of the article was "The Golden Age of Neuroscience Has Arrived. We have learned more about the thinking brain in the last 10 to 15 years than we have in all of previous human history." So let's go back in time just a bit. I want you to meet Herbert Simon, a cognitive psychologist. He's the 1978 Nobel winner in economics for his work on decision making. He challenged classical economists who assumed people always approach decisions in a rational way, and that they make decisions in their own self-interest. Herbert said that people were boundly rational. In other words, they weren't completely rational, meaning people did their best in making decisions given constraints of time, money, emotions, even IQ. More famous economists who've come many years after him that you've heard of, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who wrote Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, Stephen Levitt, who wrote Freakonomics, Richard Thaler, who wrote Nudge. They all have progressed Herbert's work. They documented that these limitations are somewhat consistent and predictable, and that is the huge breakthrough, because anything that is consistent and predictable can be leveraged. So if this was a live presentation in front of an audience, by now somebody would have asked me if leveraging these biases is a bad thing. Is it immoral? Well, as a marketer, I can only say that we'd be foolish not to leverage them, especially if they're consistent and predictable. You know, the objective of marketing is to quickly get somebody to say yes or to influence a decision. And so when you think about that, when you're ignoring cognitive bias, you're not really running very aerodynamically. There's a lot of friction in your marketing message. And when you are leveraging cognitive bias, it's like having the wind at your back, and you can become a much more efficient marketer. You know, let's face it, as Robert Louis Stevenson said, everybody is always selling something. And it's really true. I mean, if we're selling a product or service, then it's pretty obvious that we're trying to convince somebody to do something. But let's just consider some of the other things we're trying to get people to do. considering an HDHP, putting money in an HSA, participating in a health screening, saving for retirement, purchasing disability insurance, eating healthier, starting exercise, migrating inappropriate ER visits to urgent care, plugging gaps in care, stopping medication non adherence, increasing preventative care visits, shopping around for lower cost services and prescription drugs, increasing your life insurance to appropriate levels. Maybe it's even just cleaning the refrigerator or submitting a weekly report or going to bed early for the parents at home. At the end of the day, we're always trying to sell something and motivate people to do something that we want them to do. You through a few slides that have additional resources that I would recommend for any of you who want to continue to read up on cognitive bias and behavioral economics. The first is 4 books, all written by the same set of authors. It's Chip Heath and Dan Heath. They're brothers. They wrote 4 excellent books: The Power of Moments, Made to Stick, Switch, and Decisive, all of which I'd highly recommend. They're very easy reads. Then 4 must-have books for anybody who wants to get serious about understanding these concepts: Predictably Irrational, Nudge, Blink, and Thinking Fast and Slow. And then finally, The Cure for Stupidity, Misbehaving, The Undoing Project, and Sapiens. In terms of podcasts, these 3 are just excellent and a lot of fun to listen to. NPR's The Hidden Brain, Freakonomics Radio, and The Brainy Business by Melinda Palmer. And then finally, there's a few TED Talks that I think are really engaging and an easy way to sort of wrap your mind around some of these concepts. From Malcolm Gladwell and Dan Ariely to Barry Schwartz and Daniel Kahneman. You can get the titles of these TED Talks off this slide. And then I added 4 more TED Talks that I would also recommend you watch.